My name's John Hall. I'm really deeply honored that Janelle Seeger asked me to call us together at this moment. I'm going to begin with a few personal remarks after saying some thank yous on behalf of Janelle, and then following a brief interlude, we're going to hear from four people who knew George very well at various points in his life. And after that, some of George's family members are going to speak. And then we'll have an open microphone. Anybody who wants is welcome to come up and share remembrances and thoughts and so forth. So, and Janelle specifically wanted to thank Megan, Michelle, Corey, and Geraldine for inspiration and decorations, Rick Manning for video and music, and always saying yes to, can you change this? And thanks also to the speakers who are going to speak here today for sharing a little bit of George's spirit. Thanks to his sons and daughters-in-law and for their wonderful grandsons. And thanks to George for leaving us this great family and friends enough to last a lifetime. So we're here to remember George, to hold to his life as occupying a special place among us. As important, we're here to affirm with each other the memorial that lives in us, the George that is ever part of our lives. Now, George was not particularly religious in any going to church sense. However, in a text that he sent me a while back, he described himself as, quote unquote, a trained Presbyterian. And I wondered at the time whether there was really any other kind of Presbyterian. But let it be noted here that Presbyterian training is a many-splendored thing. One thing George and my cohort at Highland Presbyterian seemed to have received strong training in was the capacity to torment our Sunday school teacher, Mr. Hobart, a sincere and good man who had the faith to try to bring us through junior high school spiritually intact. George had, with me, and I know many and most of us, all of us here, an indelible effect on my life. He had a subtle capacity, not a premeditated one, a natural one, in his relations with other people. I think he could somehow draw them into becoming who they are, and more than they perhaps imagined themselves to be. For reasons I don't quite understand, at the end of 8th grade, I think it was, George asked me to serve as his campaign manager in his run to become the president of the Highland Junior High School Student Council. George did not win that election, maybe because we chose as his campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Nichols too. Little did we know at the time that the slogan, lifted from the Whig Party's successful 1840 presidential campaign, was to foreshadow George's later relationship with a subsequent Whig politician named Zachary Taylor. On June 17, 1991, with the agreement of his descendants, George and his team of medical examiners would exhume the body of President Taylor from its resting place out on Brownsboro Road in the National Cemetery. Their autopsy determined that despite rumors that had flown for more than a century, President Taylor had not been the victim of arsenic poisoning in 1850. But back to junior high school at Highland. George wrote me in a text several years ago, that was my only run for office. And I replied to him, I said, but you became state medical examiner. And he acknowledged, yes, indeed, 6 consecutive governors had appointed him to the post. In that capacity, he revolutionized Kentucky's county coroner system. He He was, he admitted, a biopolitician. Well, my early failure as George's campaign manager may have had some remote effect on his life and his association with Zachary Taylor, but he had an indelible effect on mine. And the incident I remember as clearly as it happened yesterday. In the summer of 1960, and some of you were there, a group of rising Atherton sophomores centered on Carlton Terrace was forming a rock band. You've seen the slides. The group included George, as well as Sean Cooper, Gabe Gruber, Steve Brake, Stith Bennett, Marvin Abrams, and now deceased Fred Etchen, Dean Haynes, and Boyce Carter. On what crazy whim I have never understood, they asked me to try out to become one of the background singers. On one of those hot, humid Louisville summer afternoons, not unlike this one, after I'd tried out a few songs in someone's basement, they asked me to go outside so they could discuss the matter. I stood there baking on Carlton Terrace for what seemed like quite a while. Finally, George came out. He said, in his distinct voice and cadence that we all know, he said, this is an exact quote, he said, "John, we've decided to make you business manager if you promise not to sing. And you may take some comfort that I'm going to hold to that promise today." George was like that throughout his life. He was trenchant, he was sardonic, he was funny. He was also a serious and incorruptible forensic pathologist. He would call the shots as he saw them in court, and later he would relate to you in disarming detail the incontrovertible basis of his conclusions. He was also a brave person, a hero indeed, not only in his work in the aftermath of school bus crashes and coal mining disasters, but also in rescuing his family, including bringing Janelle's mother down a ladder as their house became engulfed in flames on April 12, 1962. The man had a big heart. No surprise, George was a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. I'm not going to get into pushing my luck today talking about politics, but he would want me to mention, I think, that he had no patience for those who denied climate change. He once told me, 40 years as a forensic pathologist makes me a realist. He was not cynical, but his realism made him pessimistic about the future, about the world that we are passing on to upcoming generations. George described himself as an agnostic, not just a recovering Presbyterian, but a fully healed Presbyterian. All the same, he was quite prepared to call out evil and portray denial of climate change as the demon among us. George has been a source of grace in my life. I want to be clear, I'm not saying this in some divine sense, divine grace. I think there's a kind of redemption in this life that's not necessarily redemption in the biblical sense. Instead, it's something that we can receive here. George is a living redemption to all of us, to his sons, his wife, his grandsons, his broader family, and to the friends and colleagues and students and communities that he has met and touched on his life's journey. I suspect that George knew death more intimately than any of us here. Because of the work he carried with him what he called a weighted burden. He told me that the lifting of it, quote, only happened a few times in my life. Yet even in the face of adversity and tragedy, even burdened with his realism, and maybe even because of these qualities, George manifested an enormous joy and spirit of life. None of us lives forever, but there is an eternity in the moments of our lives with each other, if we can only grasp it. George lived that eternity over and over again with those who had the fortune to shine in his light. If we follow his good example, we will cry, yes, but we will laugh and hug each other and hold each other and help those who follow us to find their place and make a difference in this world. Now, Janelle tells me that George would have rolled his eyes, and you can see him do it, at having a moment of silence here today. So instead, to prepare for the speakers who are going to follow, we now turn to Ray Charles and his group, direct from the Blues Brothers, for a special guest appearance.
Well, I heard about the fella you've been dancing with all over the neighborhood. So why didn't you ask me, baby? Or didn't you think I could? Well, I know that the boogaloo is out of sight, but the shing-a-ling's a thing tonight. But if that was you and me out there, baby, I would have shown you how to do it right. Do it right. Uh-huh. Do it right. Do it right. Do it right. Ah, twist it. Shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, baby. Here we go, loop-de-loop. Shake it out, baby. Here we go, loop-de-lop. Bend over, let me see you shake your tail feather. Bend over, let me see you shake your tail feather. Come on, let me see you shake your tail feather. Come on, let me see you shake your tail feather. Ah, come on, baby. Come on, yeah, come on, baby. All right, do the twist, do the fly, oh, do the swim, and do the bird. Well, do the duck, do the monkey. Hey, hey, Watusi. And what about the fruit? Do the mashed potato. What about the boogaloo? Oh, the phony maroni. Come on, let's do the twist. Ah, twisting. Shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, baby. Twisting. Shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, baby. Oh, twisting. Shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it, baby. Wow!
And now we have four speakers, as I said, who knew George very well, who are going to come up and give some remarks. And we're going to start with my dear friend and George's dear friend, lifelong friend, really, John Cooper, the Louisville Falcons drummer. Ladies and gentlemen, John Cooper.
We opened all of our evening performances with Bend Over, Let Me See You Shake Your Tail Feather. It wouldn't have been a job without that song. That was the greatest thing in the world. George and I met in the 7th grade, became friends, doing stupid junior high stuff, riding our bikes, sleepovers, weird now, but that was what happened in them days. Camped out in my backyard, that was fun, and all that sort of stuff. And we, towards the end of and in fact, there's a picture up here of the little group we formed. Our music started to take us places. So we formed a little combo and we played our junior high talent show, which was a great success in our minds. Wonderful time. We did great work. And then we had a performance at Big Springs Country Club for the Women's Club. And that's where the picture in this video is from, with George. If you read the newspaper article, of course, he was the one that was mouthing all of the good stuff that we did and how it all happened. And so he got, being the good-looking, cute fellow he was, he would always be the one the reporter would go to, or somebody like that was going to, involve ourselves in paper information and so forth. So that was our music beginning. Then we hit the big town, high school. Boy, we moved in, and John Hall and myself and Steve Brake and Gabe Gruber and these guys and 6 or 7 more of us decided rock and roll band, that's the way to go. We're going to be cool. We spent an incredible amount of time together, rehearsing 2 or 3 times a week. And we played our band jobs on the weekends, dances, sock hops, a lot of bar mitzvahs. And it was just wonderful. It was just did a lot of James Brown stuff. That was incredible. But we did do one set for the Beatles. And we all dressed up as the Beatles and did all the songs at the time that they had released. And George was our sort of answer to Paul. He was sort of the cute, chubby cheek fella that, always kept things going. And so that was fun. But then the big time hit. We made a record. We made a real recording. And it didn't really hit the big time nationally, but we did get play here on Wacky, WKLO, the 2 rock stations of the time. So it was quite a situation, quite an experience. And these were the unique friendships that we will value forever. I never thought I would ever have better friends than George and all these guys. It was just incredible. Well, then we get away from high school, move on to college. George goes to U of L, gets a history degree. I don't know what that's about, but that was so. But then we decided medical school was for him, so off he went. And so that began the rest of our lives together. And during the 70s, we spent so much time with friends. We went to dinner at a number of the local restaurants, and some of you are old enough and been here long enough to remember the Blue Hawaii, the Luau Room at the airport. Dirty Men's, always a great place if you wanted to walk through the kitchen to get to the dining room. And Check's Cafe, that was open back then. So we got many, many, many times together like that. And then I see him here tonight. We would spend some Saturday afternoons in Jerry Steinberg's T-Bird. Cool car, not the little one, but a more, a bigger coupe. And he had something nobody else had in them days, a car phone. Well, the damn thing went off once and scared the hell out of all of us. We couldn't get ourselves together. It was awful. And then on Sundays, we'd be perhaps out on the river with Kenny Schmid, who George dubbed Captain Commerce. So we had so many good times like that and enjoyed so many dinners. And it was just one of those things. One of the famous outings we used to go to annually every year was the Easter beer hunt. That was a big fun time, Everybody hunts eggs, but that's not what we did. George finally bought the house next door to my house. And so one night, my youngest daughter, who's standing over there with granddaughter and sister, had a medical problem. So we called the good doctor next door. Now, George was having a party, but that didn't seem to stop him. He took his bag, put on his Mickey Mouse ears, and walked next door to take care of Lisa and announced that all's well, Dr. Mickey is here. So it was a wonderful evening. And also, that reminds me of one night there were just George and I sitting around drinking a few beers, and the state police called. That was the Beverly Hills fire. Off he went. Well, come the 80s, George meets and marries Janelle. Things really got cooking then. 3 boys, wonderful kids, raised them. They had 2 medical careers going on, raising 3 kids. They had their hands full. But eventually, George and Janelle got to the point where they could travel a bit. And fortunately, my wife, Sheila, and I were fortunate enough to be their traveling companions on many trips. Not the only traveling companions. They had many friends. But Prague, Czech Republic, Budapest, Spain, Portugal, Lisbon, just wonderful places. And then to top it all off, we did a couple of trips to New Orleans. And George and Janelle knew New Orleans, so Sheila and I were thrilled to death. They would take us places, know how to handle things. It was just an outstanding, so much fun. And then we got in the habit of dinners on the weekends. And we'd go out darn near every weekend for dinner. And that all the way up till the end, actually. And it was just such a wonderful experience to be with Janelle and George, such good friends. George accomplished a great deal during his medical career, received numerous well-deserved awards and honors, but I didn't know him as Dr. Nichols. I knew him as George. The sad time reminds us of the unique friendships we make that last a lifetime and continue to be valued even after one's passing. Goodbye, George, my long friend, my brother. I miss you terribly. May you rest in peace. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sean. And next, we're going to hear from Dr. Gregory Davis. Greg is a forensic pathologist, a lifelong friend, and George was his teacher at the University of Louisville Medical School, and after that, mentor, consultant, and friend. Greg?
Yeah. Were we ever that young? Dr. Hall said something a minute ago that made me tear up in happiness. He said that George drew people into becoming who they are. And that's certainly a gift that George, who I made the mistake of calling Dr. Nichols once, he corrected me on that. I think we all know he's a force of nature. I can't bring myself to use past tense quite yet. I think he still is a force of nature, and we see that in all the faces in this room. I will get closer to the mic, Carol. I forgot my hearing aids today, too. About everybody I've ever talked to about George Nichols, no matter how well or how casually or peripherally they knew him, would use that phrase, force of nature. And everybody knows about George's accomplishments. So I want to focus on something else, on a different aspect of this force of nature. Have you ever met somebody who, in one fell swoop, completely changes the course of your life? Just alluding to what Dr. Hall said. I did a clinical internship at U of L and went into a pathology residency thinking I was going to be a general hospital pathologist, reading pap smears and biopsies and that sort of thing. And I was one of those kids where during medical school, I stood 5 feet away from the cadaver during anatomy lab and let my buddies do the dissection. And so July and August 1986, I've got to go to the medical examiner's office. Didn't know a soul there. I figure I'm going to hold my nose for 2 months and do my duty and get out of there and do what I really want to do. I met George, and within 7 working days knew that I wanted to be a forensic pathologist. With George, L.C. McLeod, Barbara Weekly Jones, Greg Balco, Francis Masser, the other folks I met, all of whom were orbiting George. I never met a group of folks who worked so hard at such a difficult profession and yet maintained their humanity and a sense of humor. It's something that I found, Grace of George's example, if I'm relatively sane, that's what's kept it that way. And I'll try to talk louder, Carol, with that rain. The sense of intellectual endeavor, compassion, humor was always there. George was the least hierarchical person I ever met. For those of you that don't know, really still medicine is kind of a quasi-military hierarchy with ranks and that sort of thing. And the first day I met him, he said, don't call me Dr. Nichols, call me George. He He never kowtowed to power. He never talked down to those who ostensibly were below him in rank. One of the funniest stories I ever heard about George, I know there's children here, so I will modulate the way I say it, was I think he was head of the House Staff Association or something like that, and they were bringing visiting dignitaries like the mayor and council persons in to look at the dire conditions in Louisville General Hospital. And George, Daddy George is my son Joe, who's Ian's age, he used to call him, said, yeah, the cockroaches in Louisville General are big enough to rear up on their hind legs and have their way with a turkey. He said it differently. He was a player manager. He never expected anybody to do anything that he wasn't willing to do himself. And I want to close with his generosity of spirit. Yes, George could be sardonic. He did not suffer fools lightly, and I was often one of those fools. But he was one of the kindest, most generous people with his time. I was a poor resident. You know, I was always patting my pockets, and he was taking me to Check's and Bambi Bar and all those places for a hamburger. When I wrote him a couple of years ago to thank him for his guidance and mentorship over the years and how much I've tried to internalize his teaching example, he wrote back, he said, "Remember, it took us 5 years to change you from dumber than a rock to Rex the Wonder resident." And then he said, "I credit McLeod." So when just examples like when John Hunsaker, I know is in here somewhere, and Kristen Rolfe, my two colleagues in Frankfurt, had to go away to a meeting. I got called emergently to Eastern Kentucky, and I didn't want to leave the office unstaffed. And I called George in Louisville, and before I could get 6 words out, he goes, "When do you need me? I'll be there. Just tell me when." Dr. Hall alluded to Carrollton. I saw some of that amazing generosity there when Bobby Ritter and Barb Weekly Jones and Mark Bernstein and I were up there when George talked to the families of those victims and gave of himself in a way that I think very few humans ever could. On the bookshelf in front of my work desk is a hardcover collection of Frank Netter anatomical drawings. If you know, you know. They're the most amazing things in medicine. And that George gave me the day I finished my forensic pathology fellowship. And the inscription in there that I show all of my med student, resident, all of my learners from George: "Maintain your enthusiasm, always be truthful." Good advice for us all.
All right, next is Jerry Steinberg. Jerry is a Louisville attorney. I practiced saying Louisville before I come here, you know. It's and a really good friend of George's. You can, I think, see that from the photograph there. He's the president of Megan's Mountain, a cancer support nonprofit, on the board of directors of Gilda's Club, and a 2025 Bell Award recipient for his outstanding volunteer and community service.
That picture was taken in January of 2019. And it had been a little bit of time between George and I saw each other the last time. And that particular night, George and Janelle and myself and my wife Leslie and our friend Lucinda Ray gathered together at Veroni's restaurant. I'm not sure what prompted that, but to be honest with you, it had been some time since we had saw each other. And I think what George was saying, and he said this to a lot of other people, that friendship does not stop with time. And once I love you, and once you're my friend, it will always be that way. And I cherish that picture as I cherish that friendship. I met George in the 70s. I had just gotten out of law school. I was practicing law. George, I think, graduated in 72. And my friends, the Schmieds, introduced me. Wanted to know if I wanted to meet a friend of theirs named George Nichols. I would never in a million years believe that friendship would last as long as it did and culminate with the honor of my standing here tonight. He was just that kind of person. George and I had a unique relationship. For the first few years, I think almost every weekend we were together. And sometimes on Sundays, we go to that restaurant on Story Avenue and have dinner. But what really touched me the most, and I'm not sure why it happened, but whenever we had a personal problem, be it business or relationship, we would meet and have a beer and we would talk about it. And somehow we would get through it. I think more for me than for him, but we did. And when you have that type of personal relationship, you get to know a person. And I will tell you, there are few people that I met who I loved as much as him. He was good, kind, caring. He loved people. He didn't want to hurt anybody. He cared about the world. He wanted to make it a better place. And I learned a lot from those private conversations, which stay right here. So when Janelle asked me to speak, which I was honored to do, and she said, maybe you can talk a little bit about George and the law, maybe a little enlightenment of something to that. And I said, I think so. So I sat down and I started thinking about it. And then I stopped for a second and I thought, what would George want me to say? Now, George probably wouldn't want me to say anything, but we're going to do it anyhow. But what would he want me to say? And I'm not talking about George, the doctor, or the forensic pathologist, or the expert witness. I'm talking about the George that I knew from those personal conversations. And I think this is what he would say. He would say that in my lifetime, I received a lot of honors and a lot of awards. And they meant a great deal to me. And I appreciated every one of them because they made me feel good about what I was doing. But my greatest honor, my greatest award, my greatest blessing was I was able to find Janelle and love her as she loved me. She was my rock. She was my best friend. She was my bride. And she, in her own way, molded me a little bit into being a better doctor, a better person, a better father. And she helped me raise 3 great kids. And whether she knows it or not, before I left, I took a little bit of her heart, I put it in mine, so that when I left, she would be with me for eternity. And I think that's what George would have said. Now, when she asked me about talking a little bit about the law, George had a unique relationship to the media. They really got along really well. They did. And as a matter of fact, my good friend Steve Bergen, who's retired from 32, is here tonight because he had that relationship with George. But there was one of the, Doug Prophet from WHAS did a segment on George after he passed away. And I thought about that and I looked it up when I was thinking about what I wanted to say. And this is what Doug said. We have never seen a public servant like him. Outspoken, brilliant, blunt, and brash. He was made for television. And that's what I thought. You know what? I've got the perfect story because he was made for television. George, I had the opportunity to see George several times when he testified in criminal cases and in civil cases. And he took I had him take some depositions for me on some nursing home cases. He knew everything. There wasn't a stone unturned. I mean, there was no way you were going to attack him. When he walked into the courtroom, that was his world. That was his world. And he was going to stand up and he was going to testify for the kid who was abused, for the elderly who was abused, for whatever the problem was. And he did it with class, he did it with intelligence, and he commanded. There was no defense lawyer that was going to, or otherwise, that was going to turn him over. I mean, he was just perfect. And when he left the courtroom, I think Lady Justice shined a whole lot better because of him. And the world was a lot better because of him. But I want to share the other George Nichols, the one that a little bit of sometimes in the courtroom. So I had a case involving CEO of a corporation that was locked up for DUI and causing an accident and injuries and a whole bunch of other things. And he had several stores in Kentucky and Indiana, and he needed to drive around. He didn't want to lose his license. And actually, he looked like he was telling the truth. He wasn't at fault. So there are two parts of that case. First of all, I'll get rid of that real quick, was fault. And I was lucky. I found a Little Red Robin Hood that she was a sweetheart. She was a senior in a Catholic high school. She was in a church choir, and she saw the whole accident, and it definitely wasn't fault. So that was great. But it was the DUI. So I called George and I told him, I said, George, this is what I need you to testify to help me. Well, package it up and send it to me. So I got this big package of the transcript and the DUI and all, and I shipped it to him. And about 2 weeks later, his secretary calls up and she says, George wants you to be here on Wednesday at 11:30. So the night before, I spent about an hour and a half getting this case ready and to go over with him. I show up, George comes out and says, let's go to the car. Get in the car, he says, hands me an envelope. I said, what's that? He said, 5 questions. That's all you need. 5 questions. We got this case. I said, George, I need to go over it with you. Steinberg, it was never Jerry, it was Steinberg. Steinberg, we got more important things to do. I said, what's that? Where we're going to get the hamburger and what we're going to put on it. So, trial date comes up. Will you call your next witness? Dr. George Nichols. Now, pretend like I'm sitting in the witness stand. George is here. Jury's right over here. The defense table's over here. The judge is over here. And would you state your name for the record? George R. Nichols, the second. I'm going, oh man, are we in trouble? So we go through it, and George goes through his background and the information I gave him. We go through the 5 questions, and he's doing a great job. And I noticed there's this one juror, a blonde juror, somewhere in her late 30s, early 40s. And I first thought she was keened in on the case. I think she was keened in on George. You know, George was a good-looking guy. He got that wavy hair. He put a coat and towel on him. He starts to speak, and he always said, if I spoke like you were a 5th grader, I could convey to you what I needed to tell you. So I get done. George does a great job. And the prosecutor, it's his turn, and he says, Dr. Nichols, are you aware, sir, of KRS statute that allows a judge and or a juror to determine if a person is guilty of DUI without the need of a breathalyzer? And I'm thinking, oh God, I had that in my notes. I didn't go over it with him because what, get a hamburger. What is he going to do to this case? Counselor, not only am I aware of that statute, but I helped write that statute. At which case this lady was ready to jump over all the jurors and take him home. I mean, he captivated it. Actually, after it was over with, and I left the courtroom, she's standing outside. And she goes, Mr. Steinberg, yes, I want to congratulate you. She said, by the way, is Dr. Nichols married? Now, you know, it's not unusual because there was a personal injury lawyer that tried a case for about 3 weeks and fell in love with this jury. They wound up getting married for 30 years. But here I am with that question. Now, this lady, I mean, I sort of owe her, right? She's helped get my client acquitted. But on the other hand, George and Janelle, you know, so the words that a lawyer can always use is, I think, I believe. I get you. Ma'am, I believe he's married to a major on the Louisville Police Department that's in charge of the shooting range. And that ended it. But that night I called George. And by the way, I told George that was the last jury trial that I ever did, because after that I hung up my law degree and went home to get older. But and Sheila Collins she was actually the judge. Yeah. So I called George. I said, George, I wanted to tell you I won the case. Steinberg, isn't it wonderful to know that after all those years of practicing law, you finally won a case because of me? But that was, I mean, he just was, you couldn't help but love the guy. Well, Janelle called me and she said that, and when he got off the case, when it was over with, and there was no more witnesses. And Dr. Nichols, you're excused. And he walked by, and as he walked by, he goes, "You won." So I called him, and he told me that. But anyhow, so Janelle called me, and she said that George was home, but they didn't know how much longer he would be here. And if I wanted to stop by, I could. So I went over there that day, and he was in bed. He had the covers up to his neck. And Janelle was sitting next to him in bed. And he looked up and he goes, "Steinberg?" And I looked down and I said, "Dr. Nichols." It's a fog. I honestly don't remember what, if anything, was said. But at the end, he said, "I'm tired and I think I need to get some rest." And I went over and I kissed him on the forehead. I returned the favor. I kissed him on the forehead and I said, "I love you. I love you." And the next day, I got a text that he was no longer with us. And I thought about when he walked by at the end of that testimony and he said, "You won." And I thought about all those 40 years plus that we were friends. And I was in the car with my wife. We were going to Cincinnati when I got that text. And I looked up at the sky and I said, "You know what, Dr. Nichols? We both won. We both won." Thank you.
And we're now going to hear from Jimmy Pollard. Jimmy is the executive director of the Kentucky Coroners Association. He knew George throughout his entire career as a forensic pathologist and a friend. Jimmy?
I met George in 1986. That's when I was elected coroner in a little county, Henry County. And soon after that, I was at the medical examiner's office with a case. And I felt true to what some others have mentioned here today. I called him Dr. Nichols. He said, "Call me George." That's what my speech title is, "Call me George." From then on out, he was George and I was Pollard. No first name. I didn't have a first name, just my last name. So George was, as we all know, George was a unique person. There'll never be another George. Trust me. There's not going to be another George. He would give you his heart. He would give you anything he had to help you, as these other people have mentioned here today. When Janelle asked me to come and speak, and I told her, I think I told you, there's a lot of things I can talk about, George, and there's a lot I can't. The ones I can't, I'll be glad to meet you to bar over a beer or two sometime, and we can go over those. But not today. George, and what a lot of you don't know, George and a gentleman named David Jones from Frankfurt actually created the Coroner's Medical Examiners Program here in Kentucky. And it's been copied by a lot of states. It's a top program in the United States. David passed away a couple of years ago, 3 years ago now. And now George has gone, and Lord, you got your hands full now with both of them there. We'll be thinking about that. But George would, even when he retired, he didn't retire. George never retired. I could call him and did, and consult with him on cases that I'd have. And he was glad to take it. I sent him records and sent him files and sent him several different times. He didn't have to do that. He didn't get a penny for it, didn't ask for a penny. He wouldn't take anything. But he never retired. And that I can really, really goes back to, I remember when he first taught and I was first elected coroner, we had a basic training class. And George came to basic training to talk. He literally scared the hell out of me. Now, this is before I had a case. I thought, man, we got to work with this guy, listening to it. But after we got out of the class and was standing out in the hallway talking, you wouldn't even think that was the same George. It's the same person, So he inspired me a lot in as far as how to handle people and how to handle cases. And he was always watching over you. I had a case one time we had worked it all day, started in the morning, early morning, all day and up into the night. And it was early morning the next morning before I got the case to the medical examiner's office. I was wore out. My brain was mush. Didn't know what I was writing, didn't know what I was doing. I dropped the body off and went home. I was asleep, my phone rang. I answered it. Pollard? Yes. George Nichols? Yes. He said, do you realize what you did down here? No, George, I didn't. What'd I do? He said, well, you SOB, you put your name on the toe tag instead of the decedent's. So, he was always looking out for you. And it made you feel good. You knew he had your back. As some have mentioned here, George had a unique way of getting what he wanted. He had a unique way of getting out of things. Like they were talking, the attorney here was talking a while ago, George really, he testified thousands of times. He really got tired of being asked, what are your credentials, Dr. Nichols? What are your credentials in this field? Well, he got tired of having to just read his resume or talk about his resume. So next time he testified, they asked him, said, what are your credentials? He started out when he was in the first grade and went all the way to the graduation of medical school. Well, you people here that are in the law group, you know how news travels. Well, that got around. George wasn't asked that anymore. So, and George is always willing to help. He's always willing to give a hand. He was always willing to help. My small community, we had a little independent school there, and we were having a lot of teenage accidents, serious accidents, not really fatalities, but serious accidents. Well, the superintendent of the school had asked me if I had a program or I had anything that I could present to help with a kind of a driver's edge or driver's awareness program. So I said, well, actually I don't, but I know who I think it does. And I told him, I said, I called Dr. George Nichols. Oh, that'd be great. We've heard of him. We know him. I said, yeah. And I said, but I said, let me tell you before I commit. Scheduling the governor was easier than scheduling George. So I talked to George. We got it all worked out. We're going to do it. Got it, the date, the time, and everything. And I got to thinking about it. And these were 15, 16, 17-year-old kids. And so I said, talked to George one day, and I said, George, these are 16, 17-year-old kids. I said, don't get too graphic. Pollard, I've got this. Okay, I won't ask again. We'll see what happens. So the day came, and they were doing some introductions and introduced George. You can still, you know how those kids that age, you can still hear people, you know, they talking and carrying on. They know more than anybody. So got George up there. This is back long ago. Some of you younger guys probably don't even remember. This was slides. It wasn't a PowerPoint. It was slides. So that tells you how long ago. So I said, anyway, I was standing there, sitting there next to George, and he went up and he introduced himself, did a little background of what he does. So he started his presentation, clicked that clicker. What showed up on the screen? A body on the autopsy table. Well, once I got my legs back under me after I sat down, but you know what? After that, you could hear a pin drop in that auditorium. And it went well, went great. After it was over, George was packing up, he was leaving, and superintendent came over and he said, is this something we can schedule annually or something that you could come? I said, let's wait to see how many calls from attorneys we get. So, and not because of that, but George never did do it again. So, George had, like I say, he had a way of talking and getting his way, and he was intimidating to a lot of people. He was having some issues at the medical examiner's office that really needed to be addressed, and he was trying to get them fixed. And Greg, he touched on one thing that he addressed it and explained the mating habits of a cockroach and a pigeon. But this time he it was a problem with a cooler, and George had been trying to get it fixed. Well, he ends up calling the governor's office, and he said, "I'm telling you right now, if we don't have this fixed by," it was just like 2 days or something, "I'm going to start bringing bodies and stacking them on the steps of the Capitol." It got fixed. They were scared to death of George Nichols. They knew he would do it. But it got fixed. But he made an impact on everybody he touched, and everybody. And Janelle, this room wouldn't hold the people if that George has helped in some way. And he was amazing to me. George and I was close with George and David, and after David passed away, our association developed a award in his name, and I said, well, who better to give that award out would be George. And I think you all came over to the conference like 3 times. We gave away at our conference, and George got it one year, and we presented it to him, and then he came back and gave it out. But he would always, and you could tell he really didn't feel good, but he came, he showed up. So we enjoyed him, and he loved coming around our conference and being with other corners and that he hadn't seen in a long time. But George is kind of like myself. We're getting to the point to where there's a lot more we don't know than there are the ones we know anymore. So, but I'm not going to take up any more time here. I miss George. I always will. And to say he'll be missed is an understatement. He's going to be missed terribly. Not only by the medical examiners. And oh, I have one more story. What Georgia it really helps out. A couple of years ago, we had an issue happen within the medical examiner's office that the doctors were very much underpaid. Techs were underpaid. The admin was underpaid, and so we wasn't really getting, or Dr. Ralston at the time wasn't really getting the cooperation out of the Justice Cabinet that he needed. So we, as the Coroners Association, just stepped in and said, well, we'll do it. So we started working on it, and we said we need something that's, it's going to influence these legislators, because it's going to have to be a bill that's going to have to be passed. We were asking for $7 million. So George I got one of those. I used to get these late night after happy hour random text messages from George. And I enjoyed it. We would talk back and forth. But anyway, he called me and he said, Pollard, yes, George. He said, how are you all coming on your legislation for the salaries? I said, well, we're working on it. What can I do? I'll do whatever you want me to do. What can I do? I said, George, anything you do. Well, he dictated a letter. It was a very powerful letter, very good letter. And that letter went to every legislator in Frankfort, plus the governor's office. And I'll never will believe anything any different, but I think that influence with that letter helped us achieve to get that $7 million. So he never quit. He never quit helping, and he won't. So, but like I say, to miss him is an understatement. We miss him now. Thank you.
And we'll now hear from some of George's family members, specifically his sons, and we're going to start out with Ian. And so Ian Nichols, thank you.
All right, everybody put your mustaches on just real quick, everybody in the crowd. George had a complicated relationship with love. Don't worry, I'm not really going to go there. Can you imagine the look on my dad's face if I started out like that? He'd roll his eyes and say, stop, just stop. Or he'd tell me to hurry up and get on with it, so I will. Many of you knew him as Dr. Nichols, or Dr. Death, the first Kentucky State Medical Examiner. He built the program from the ground up, testified in countless trials, taught future pathologists, and led with precision and candor. He could command a courtroom and deal with things that most of us would look away from. His work mattered deeply to him, and he took it seriously. My dad did know how to love. It just showed up in his own subtle and sometimes stubborn ways. He wasn't the warmest man, but he tried. He'd make sure your favorite dinner was ready, always with enough Coors Light for me and him. And there was always white wine and Diet Coke on hand for my mom, as if that were some unbreakable law of the universe. He loved his friends. He genuinely enjoyed them. Listening, debating, laughing at good jokes or bad politicians. He was a good dancer. I always imagined that rhythm went back to his days singing in the Louisville Falcons. But really, it was the way he looked at my mom when he danced that mattered. He'd remember something he mentioned in passing, some random fact, just to bring it up months or even years later, just to check in. He took me and my brothers fishing, skiing, scuba diving. He wasn't exactly an adventure junkie. He was a doctor and a historian, but he wanted us to have those memories anyway. He made all of our friends feel welcome, no matter how weird, awkward, or funny. He just liked people. He was remarkably tolerant of my mom's cats. Although I suspect he was a closeted cat lover himself. He adored his dogs, Miller and Coors, whom he called sons number 4. My dad had a big heart. He was a good man, and I learned much from him. He was so proud of us, mostly for not naming any of our sons George, but truly for the men we turned into. He loved each of his daughter-in-laws and doted on his grandsons. He'd never say he was proud of us to our faces, but he would tell every stranger, friend, or former student just how proud he was. I remember him taking us to the medical examiner's office because he believed in a practical education. Nothing says wear your seatbelt quite like a real-life demonstration. And he had no problem explaining exactly why cocaine or firearms were bad for your heart or head, complete with visual aids. He could be brutally honest, sometimes too honest, but you always knew where you stood with him. He loved cooking and gardening, things that weren't exactly stereotypical dad activities of the 90s. But he taught us the joy of growing things and feeding the people you love. He wasn't always easy. He had his struggles. He didn't have the best relationship with his own father, but he worked hard to be better. He loved my mom for decades. Most of the time, they even admitted it. They were partners in every sense. He was complicated, funny, brilliant, stubborn, and honest. He was my dad, and I'm grateful for every moment we had. Thank you.
It was recently Take Your Kid to Work Day, and it got me thinking about the first time my dad took me to his work. See, he was Kentucky's first chief medical examiner, serving from 1977 to 1997, a pioneering figure whose work shaped both the medical and legal landscapes of our state and beyond. I was in 4th grade when I spent that unforgettable day with him in the Frankfurt facility where I assisted with autopsies, like helping to reassemble the remains of a decapitated and burned cadaver, or watching him masterfully dissect a heart. I also saw the camaraderie, the sardonic humor, and the resilience of people who look death in the face every day. He and his staff also goaded me into telling the story at school, complete with a Polaroid photo of me and a different corpse, which, yes, got me in trouble with Miss Butt at a show and tell day. But if you knew George, none of that would surprise you. Before we left town that day, he took me to meet Governor Paul Patton at the mansion. Then I had a nightmare in the backseat of this old black Bronco on I-64 on the drive home. Just one, though. That day stayed with me just like he has. Our dad was a giant in his field. He testified in landmark cases like the Beverly Hills Supper Club fire, the Carrollton bus crash, and Mel Ignato's murder trial, and he oversaw the historic exhumation of President Zachary Taylor, just to name a few. But he didn't just conduct autopsies. He clarified truth in the pursuit of justice, and in so doing, he influenced my decision to pursue law. He wielded language like a scalpel. A well-placed one-liner could leave a courtroom howling or find its way into the New York Times. And I'm pretty sure he would still say that Matt Bevin is an asshole. Sorry. Google that one if you don't get the reference. But what struck me most was how he spoke in court. Directly, clearly, respectfully. He trusted juries to understand. He didn't use jargon. He didn't perform. He connected and was able to convey complex ideas in digestible ways, just like the history professor he always wanted to be. That's why he was the most sought-after expert witness I've ever known. And for the attorneys here, Steinberg, who used his services, you're welcome, because I could never convince him to raise his fees. George cooked like a trained chef, a skill passed down from his grandmother. His chili often won first place at the fire department's annual cook-off, where the people simply called him Doc. He also coached soccer, taught his 3 sons to cook, cheered from the stands at my football games, and took us on outdoor adventures. He lived a full, intentional life. But his most deliberate choice was to be the kind of father he had never known. When I was a sophomore in high school, George and I were going to a U of L basketball game. And before we left, Janelle pulled me aside and said something that shocked me. I just want you to know that your grandfather died last week. So people will probably be coming up to Dad to say they're sorry. See, our dad had a difficult childhood. He never had a relationship with his father, and he never wanted one. So none of his 3 sons ever met our grandfather. But George broke that cycle. All of us had a real, meaningful relationship with him, and so did all of his grandchildren. That was by his design, though. That was his legacy. Even in his final months battling cancer, he remained the best version of who he'd always been. The last time we said goodbye, he hugged me and said, "Dill, it's gonna be okay." Last spring, I was home helping our mom figure out what to do with the suits. The last jacket I picked up had an unexpected crinkle in the breast pocket. It was my program for my law school graduation 10 years earlier. He'd kept it all that time. And Lord knows I didn't keep mine. Coincidence or not, that unexpected moment brought me to tears, clearly. And that profound moment stuck with me and probably always will. My wife often finds dimes on the ground, reminders of her grandfather's joke that he used to tell. Our mom says she finds hidden notes from Dad tucked around the house, quiet affirmations of his love. And I know I'll keep finding mine. The quiet reminders that he was always proud of me. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michelle Breeze Nichols. I'm Dylan's wife. I met Dylan at Ian and Lauren's wedding in Denver. So technically, I met George and Janelle before I even met my husband. And knowing Ian and Lauren previously, I knew it was a great family. So coming back into town Thursday, Dylan and I lived here from 2009 to 2019 together. So very formative years for us in a relationship. We dated, we got engaged, married, had our first son here. So as you all know, Louisville, the first 40 minutes I was back in town, I had to run an errand and ran into 4 friends. So it was good to be home, so to speak. So as I was driving, this poem just popped into my head because I was happy to be back for George. And so this is a poem entitled George. He was never one to bite his tongue, and he always loved when my old Kentucky home was sung. He was a true Commonwealther through and through, although you would never catch him wearing UK blue, except for that one apron. I don't know what that was about. By now you can tell he was well regarded, and with his profession, he kept the truth safely guarded. He loved his sons and grandsons, even sponsored one to be an official Kentucky colonel. He filled the role of father-in-law well, and he never missed a chance to kiss Janelle. He wasn't a fan of Christmas, but the scowl on his face when we sing Christmas carols is one that I will miss. Happiness shone in his eyes on our last goodbye. Paul McCartney said it best, "Blackbird fly." Cheers.
He did that to me one time in the Ohio River. My name is Mark Lalonde. With the medical examiner's office in the state of Mississippi. And I'm honored to be here. I'm sad to be here, but thank you, for the invitation. And I made a few notes, but after everything everybody said, I'm probably going to add a couple things. But I haven't seen George's children since they were this big with my children. And my children are grown, but they remember
Halloween parties at George's house. George scared the crap out of my kids with a chainsaw. I met George 35 years ago. And I just finished my forensic training in Memphis, and he hired me as the medical examiner in Madisonville, in Western Kentucky. And he said, so like other relationships, to me, he was chief. To him, I was Levon. So he said to me, Levon, I think you're well trained. Run it the way you want to. Just don't piss me off. And he says, oh, one other thing. He says, you're living in Western Kentucky. He says, I'm going to tell you how to communicate. You got to learn how to say shit bar and tar arm. So I did. But, everything has been said about George. I met Ian. Can't get it. I met. Well, for a moment there it is, George. So I had a personal and professional relationship with Chief for about 35 years or more. To me, he was an educator. He loved to teach. He was my mentor. He was extremely intelligent. And what I learned from him was his confidence and his opinion. And when I would call and ask for advice or an opinion, I would never falter. If he said, this is the way it is, Levon, yes, sir, George, I agree. And I went and testified or wrote a report on his advice. He was wise, and his wisdom to me is priceless. He was always there. I've worked in multiple different states over the years, and no matter where I worked, I would always call him if I had a question. And if I didn't call him, a couple weeks later, a month, I get a phone call. Levon, yeah, Chief, you all right? Yes, sir. I hadn't heard from you. Just want to make sure you're okay. Yes, sir. Well, you know my phone number. If you need anything, call me. Bye. That was the conversation. But he was always there for me. He was my most trusted colleague in all of forensic medicine. There was nobody else that I wanted opinion from than Chief. I never doubted his opinions, and his advice I took absolutely. And when I had questions, he would say, okay. He said, I'll have Tom send you some articles, read them, and then call me back. And I did. So after all the great things have been said about George, or to me, Chief, you don't just like a guy like that. You love a man like that. And I love George. So I'm not here to say goodbye to George, because he lives here forever. I'm here once again to say thank you, Chief.
And I first met George at the old General Hospital with Barbara Weekly Jones, and where she did an autopsy in about 20 minutes. And but the main thing I was going to say is that I owe a lot to George, including it's being one of the people who's responsible for my being a medical examiner in Kentucky for a bunch of years. And I'm about to turn 83, so I figure I'm not the only one here with gray hair. But for many years, then I knew George. And the main thing I would say is that he was, and I'm not Yiddish, but he was a mensch, a person of integrity and honor. And he always demonstrated that. And part of that included what we all hoped and aspired to be as good humans, and that was love. And there are many ways in which he expressed that. As been mentioned, he was with Dave Jones, the late great Dave Jones, who was one of his best buddies ever that I knew, was responsible for creating the medical examiner program, Chapter 72 in the Kentucky Revised Statutes. Way back when, it became a great example for bringing in scientific-based death investigation to a jurisdiction, in this case Kentucky, and it's been followed in other places since then too. So he loved the state, and he loved the people that he worked with. He was always available, as been mentioned. One time in Lexington, 5 people were killed in one day. So he and one of his stalwart residents, Greg Balco, the late Greg Balco, came over and pitched in to help me work through that particular situation. And that's one example. One thing George loved was driving real fast. Early in the 80s, when I was on my way to Moorhead for a Corners Conference, I was driving on Interstate 64 heading east, and I saw a little dot in the rearview mirror. A few seconds later, it looked like a jet of some kind that passed by me, and I didn't know what it was. Finally I got there. I was going a bit slower than that vehicle and got to the medical examiner's office up in Moorhead, and there I saw the jet in the parking lot and walked in, and there was George writing on the green board, talking to the coroners about a subdural hematoma. So he moved out. And I know he and Barbara had a lot of challenges in the early days where they were taking care of the whole state and were driving everywhere to go to court. And when I started in Lexington, I gave them a little bit of a break for the eastern part of the state. But I just want to say that I was surprised to hear when he died. I didn't know he was ill. If it was of melanoma, I can understand that. I had a brother who died a little bit earlier than at George's age of melanoma, and I know that's not the best way to go. But I'm sure he had extremely amount of love and family association through that whole time to help him work his way through that. The last thing I'll say in terms of love, it's a different kind of love. Now, I've never seen George naked, but one time he and Janelle were kind enough to let me and my wife stay over at one of the houses they had in Louisville, and there was a special room whose name I will not speak now, but just because of it started with an F, and that's where I think all 3 of these kids started. So to his children, I'm saying I was there before you, but you came along. At any rate, he was a unique person, and I will never forget the great things he had in spite of our differences from time to time. And I think that just about everyone that knew him feels the same way. So thank you.
My name is Ira Simmons. I've had a long career. I was with the Louisville Times and the Courier Journal, and I worked for Kentucky Educational Television. I met George in the 8th grade, and when I was a journalist, I kept running into him, and we would talk. And I did a story once called "The Kentucky Derby is Dangerous to Your Health." And it really is, because if you have a problem in the infield, you're going to get help a lot faster than if you're up in Billionaires Road, because they don't want to make a scene up there. And I learned all sorts of interesting facts. If you're hosting a derby party and a guest passes out, you always want to flip them over face down. That happens all the time. And you have to be very careful. You don't want anyone inhaling their drinks. But George once told me he seemed so much older than the rest of us. He was very precocious. And I thought, well, maybe he just seemed that way. And one day we were talking. We were sharing beers actually on my back porch, and he said, "You know, I think I grew up too fast." And I thought, in some ways, he had to, maybe. But he loved music, and he told me one time, in grade school, in junior high, he would take a bus down to the West End and hang out at the black clubs, Joe's Palm Room. There were a couple of just tremendous clubs, and a lot of great jazz people came out of Louisville. Jonah Jones and Lee Lux Lewis, and a lot of great people. And he would fool with his trumpet with them. He was very serious about it. And in the course of this, one day, someone offered him a reefer. And George smoked marijuana in the 9th grade, is what he did. He was ahead of us. But he said, you know, I grew up too fast. I grew up too fast. And when I was with KET, I can't exactly remember the year, but I think it was the late 90s. Kentucky led the country in teenage traffic deaths. And Montana doesn't have a speed limit, but it led the whole country, you know. And so I asked George, it was a 4-part series aimed at 10th graders. And the idea was you have to acknowledge that driving is exciting to them. You have to acknowledge that they have no fear of death. You have to acknowledge that they don't want to be disfigured. That's their big fear. And so we approached it that way, and I asked George to participate. We spent a day at the autopsy center, and we interviewed him. And he, as has been said, he was great on television. And he was so compelling and really kind of stole the show. And today that series is all over the country. And I'm will always be grateful to George for helping out. And I can't believe, when I heard that he had died, I just can't believe such an exuberant person was removed from my life. I could, you know, it's just hard to imagine. But in a way, I think it's been truly said that you lose someone like that only when you die. And I think a bit of George will live on. Will live on with all who knew him. Thanks a lot.
I'm Kurt Fenberg. I'm an obstetrician gynecologist, and I've come from California to tell you 10 things that I think I remember about George Riley Nichols II. I've only practiced this 30 times, and I don't have my cadence down yet, so bear with me. Number 1, 1968, our first year of medical school at the University of Louisville. I met the king of cool. Cool hair, cool demeanor, cool car. I'm not sure if that was a Malibu or a GTO convertible. Cool history. I thought he was a poli-sci major, but apparently it was history, not biology like all the rest of us. He even smoked cools. The only other cool smoker I knew was John Rose, and I think they smoked him because people wouldn't bum him. Number 2, he was generous of spirit. He got me my first job in Louisville as a lifeguard at Fountain Ferry Park in the West End. It lasted one day. I had one save, and then the riots closed it down and off to the ammo factory across the river for me. Number 3, he was imaginative and filled with ingenuity, as evidenced by hosting an alcohol-fueled Easter egg hunt. our sophomore year of medical school, out in some field, I think in this area. Number 4, he had a magnetic personality. Whenever George was in a room, people would gravitate to him for comment, affirmation, and opinion. Number 5, he was resilient. George had to repeat neuroanatomy. He must have irritated somebody. So off to Arkansas for that summer. He never blinked an eye, passed the course, and put it behind him to achieve future greatness. Number 6, he could turn a phrase. Having read in the JAMA, as was my wont, the obituaries every week, I saw about the passing of his father, and I expressed my condolences, and his response was, well, he missed the ride to the old folks' home. And I once asked him about how he acquired his remarkable administrative skills, and he said you have to learn to say 2 things. 1, no. 2, you're fired. Number 7, organizational skills. In the 1980s, at our 10-year reunion, he managed to make several of us speakers so we could write off the trip. I spoke about my New Zealand experience as a sheep man, and among others, the pinhead, Jamie Powell, gave a great talk on emergency room medicine, but that was thanks to George. Number 8, his kindness. 2 years ago, when my wife Tina and I celebrated 50 years of marriage here in Louisville, he and Janelle were so kind to gift me 2 of my favorite things. A hot brown plate, had one this morning, and my bourbon trail cap. But long ago, when I had a cheeseburger addiction, he gifted me, he always knew the best restaurants. He gifted me Fat Margaret's, which was out on Preston Highway. It was kind of rough, maybe in a bowling alley, I don't know, but they had great cheeseburgers. Number 9, his love of basketball and Louisville, the Louisville Cardinals. Need I say more, Lowell? Number 10, surpassing that love, he was blessed with Janelle and 3 sons, celebrating in a life well lived. Thank you.
I'm Barbara Weekly Jones. I was George's other female. I remember meeting George in 1967 at a party that Tom, where is Tom? Tom was at. He was there to pick up George, to keep Tom out of trouble. We then met again when I was a sophomore in medical school, and he taught one of the unit labs. I did my residency at pathology the same year George came back from his fellowship in forensic pathology that he did in Ohio. I was one of the few residents that enjoyed doing autopsies. So I covered him on weekends when he wanted to take off, because truly it was just George. Francis Messer, and Elsie McLeod from Indiana. He hired me when I finished in 1981 as the assistant medical examiner, and also asked me to be a partner in a private lab that we had for many, many years. He introduced me all the time as one of the women who had been in his life longer than any other female except his mom. He was an interesting fellow, and when it came to his social life, already being married once when I met him, he then married an ER doc, which ended in a divorce. And then he hired a secretary for the ME office, for our office, who was young and good looking. I told George, don't screw the help. And he says, I know. Well, what can we say? At that time, he was also dating Janelle. Well, it was close. Well, okay. So they were both, I was in the autopsy room doing an autopsy. And she came in, and Janelle came in, and the other person was also there. And all I could do was hide behind the autopsy table because I didn't know what was going to happen. So, but it was fun. And I told George after that, George, do not let Janelle go. She's the best thing that's ever happened to you. And so, yay, we got a new secretary, and Janelle hung in there. George told me the only reason to get married at that point in time is if he had a child. So, so he did. So Janelle and he got married. She got pregnant and he got married. So I had a shower for them that had a cake that had baby booties on one side and wedding bells on the other. So we had a combined shower at that time, but they all thought it was great. I wish George had not. The one thing that I really wish that George had never done was put in his resignation to the Department of Justice director at the time that he did not get along with at all. He was a very military guy, and I think George wanted to take it back, but in the meantime, this guy accepted his resignation. So George had retired after 20 years of being a medical examiner, where he still could have been a medical examiner. So that was a very sad part for me, because I had to go on without George in the office anyway. I think that we don't talk enough about George and the credit that he deserves for doing or starting the medical examiner program here in Kentucky, and the clinical forensic medicine program that started here in Kentucky and is now in all the states in the United States. He doesn't get credit for that either. Seriously though, he was the smartest, kindest, sweetest man that I have ever known, and my mentor in crime, and I love him. And I'm sorry I could not go see him at the last couple of days, but I remember him saying when we were doing the Carrollton bus accident he told the family, remember your children as they are. And I could not go and see George that way. I remember him as the vibrant gentleman that he always was, and I loved him.
Hello, I'm Amy. I'm one of George's trainees, employees, and groupies. I first learned of George Nichols back in the early 1980s. I was a young college kid thinking I was going to become a veterinarian. And the Courier-Journal did an article about George in the paper about how Kentucky has this new and first medical examiner. And after reading the article, I thought, that's a fascinating career. That's a fascinating man. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I would ever meet George, much less work with him and become one of his friends. As you can imagine, George was an incredibly fun boss. And I think my favorite Georgeism he would say after we had a long, arduous day in the autopsy room, we'd be back there for hours. George would be taking off his gloves and he'd say, that's it, we're done for the day. We're not going to do another case unless a mayor dies in a whorehouse fire. I love that quote. My sister loves that quote. One time we were driving to Hardin County, having to go to a trial. George was driving, and somebody with a handicap placard recklessly cut George off. And you can imagine George was not too happy about that. And he turns to me and he says, whenever you see a handicap sticker, believe it. So now whenever I see a handicap sticker, I always think of George, and hopefully maybe you guys will too. George told me a story about one time when he had to prepare this young prosecutor. It was her first trial with George, and so he took a lot of time preparing her for his testimony and going over how she was going to qualify him, going over his education, background, experience. He said he spent a lot of time working with her. So the day of the trial comes, and George gets on the stand, and the prosecutor says, so, Dr. Nichols, tell the jury something about yourself. And I'm sure you can imagine the look on George's face when he looks at her, and I'm sure he looked at the judge, and you know the judge is rolling his eyes and bracing himself for what's about to come. And he looked at the jury and he said, my wife tells me I'm the father of two. And I don't know if you guys know this, but in his younger days, George was a bit of a ladies' man. I think you kind of gathered some of that if you didn't know it. But there's one woman that caught his eye and caught his heart. And I have the utmost respect and admiration for Janelle for putting up with George for all those years and putting up with 3 little Georges. There was one day George had to leave the office rather urgently. The Nichols boys were evidently doing something they ought not to have been doing. And one of them fell off the roof of a house. And, you know, being a forensic pathologist, we know what can happen to somebody when they fall off a house. So we were scared to death to hear what happened to the little child. So the next time we see George, we're like, George, how is he? He says, oh, Dylan broke both his forearms. He comes out of the exam room, both forearms in a cast, and he yells across the ER. He says, hey, Mom, does this mean you have to wipe my butt? Do you remember that? when George turned 50, we had to have a surprise party for him. So, of course, we planned it several weeks in advance so he wouldn't catch on to it. And we decided to have it at the Coach Lamp, which was this great little hole-in-the-wall neighborhood bar run by Jim and Peggy, 2 of his good friends. And it was just across the parking lot from our office. And so we're like, well, how are we going to get George to come to the Coach Lamp at 7 o'clock at night? So I asked Gene Sherrard, who was the commander of Louisville Police Homicide Unit. I said, Gene, you got to call George. Tell him Jim has been murdered in his bar, and he needs you to come out there and help him. So I can just imagine what's going through George's head as he's driving to the Coach Lamp, expecting to find Jim's poor body on the floor, but instead finds a bunch of yahoos jumping out and yelling surprise at him. And I believe he had a good time. I think that was the picture with him and Davis. I don't think the people of Kentucky will ever know how indebted they are to George for all that he's done. And I know that I am forever indebted to George for giving me the fellowship, giving me the job, the career, the memories, a few nightmares, all the wonderful people that I've met in this job. And I know as we sit here today, we still can't fathom that George is gone. But George was larger than life, and he's larger than death, and he's going to live on with all of us. Thank you.
Okay, we have had a wonderful experience sharing stories, and George, as we've said several times, lives in all of us. And part of the way that George lives on is the stories that people tell about George. And I feel like we've gotten a very good sample this afternoon, but we've also just scratched the surface, I know from personal experience. And so we can now share with each other stories, and the stories that we tell will live on, and George lives on for generations, I truly believe. So thank you so much for being here, and I know Janelle and the family appreciates it so deeply. Thank you so much.